It was supposed to be the weekend getaway of a lifetime in the heart of the Lone Star State.
They came to Houston to party and enjoy the nightlife.
He was doing what guys usually do, get girls, have a good time.
But the party's over when a shooting starts.
There were gunshots ringing throughout the neighborhood.
Harris County 911.
I don't know where I'm at, but they shooting. I'm scared.
He's shot multiple times, in the chest, in the arm, just everywhere.
This was a very dire situation.
Were these tourists simply victims of bad luck? Or were there more sinister factors at play?
What? I remember just thinking to myself, like, this can't be happening. How? Why?
It just didn't make sense. This person isn't even from the city.
As detectives work to unravel this mystery, they will learn trust is a luxury few can afford.
This was a very toxic situation.
Come on.
I think it's a passion-fueled, jealousy-fueled crime.
I have no problem. How do you know what they people from it?
Sometimes it takes a long time to get to the truth, but that's what we did here.
This was a cold, calculated murder.
June 28th, 2021. It's not yet daylight in Houston, Texas, a city that attracts millions of tourists every year to enjoy its sports, restaurants, and world-class nightclubs.
Houston is a large city, and we have a very vibrant nightlife. It is an attraction, especially down in the southwest part of Houston.
If you come to Houston, you're going to be welcomed, you're going to enjoy a lot of great food, a great time, great party atmosphere.
But in the early hours of this Monday morning, the city is suddenly thrown into chaos.
Just around 3 a.m., there was an influx of 911 calls.
Harris County 911. We think we might have just heard gunshots. Oh my God, somebody's shooting.
They're still shooting right now?
I'm scared. I'm in the back of my car. For sure.
By the sound of the reports, at least one person has already been injured.
Finish on my phone. Hurry up, please.
Police race to the scene of the crime, a home in the affluent Houston neighborhood of Old Oaks.
It's a quiet neighborhood. This is unusual to have this type of disturbance.
When officers arrived, they were fully prepared to confront an armed shooter.
But instead, they only find the aftermath of the violent attack.
They see this young man in dire need. He's shot multiple times, in the chest, in the arm, just everywhere.
He's been pummeled with shots. Whomever shot him meant to do intentional and extensive damage, because they did.
It's really bad, yet he's still breathing.
There were some witnesses gathered around, and they were very distraught.
The young man's friends identify him as 28-year-old Gregory Moore.
Gregory Moore was losing blood fast.
They wanted to get him to the nearest hospital so that he could get to the emergency room.
Time was of the essence if they were going to save this man's life.
New York native Gregory Moore's outgoing personality and warm-hearted demeanor meant he had no trouble making friends.
He was a great, great friend. You could never just be mad at him, even when you wanted to be, you know, he just made you laugh. He was funny. He was a goofball.
He was just one of those guys who seemed like he could get along with anyone, always the life of the party.
But Gregory wasn't just the life of the party. He was also a dedicated father.
We had a family young. He was an amazing dad. He was not the disciplinary. He was the fun parent. He was the kind of parent that would be like, it's raining out, don't go to work today, let's stay home and watch movies. Or let's put a bunch of blankets on the floor and let the kids just do what they want.
However, as much as Greg loved his children, the pressures of parenthood put a strain on his relationship with their mother, Tatiana Anderson.
We were together for 10 years, so time took its course on our relationship, and we kind of had to separate to figure ourselves out.
Greg started to date other people and had a child with another woman in 2018.
By the summer of 2021, Greg was focused on being the best parent he could be and building his career.
He used to work the night shift. He was a community technician, so he was on the front line with the population that is underserved the most. He had gotten to a place where he didn't know if that was something he wanted to continue to pursue. So he was thinking of going to trade school and just trying to build from that. He was talking about opening a business.
And in June of that year, Gregory decided to take a well-deserved break from the stresses of life by planning a trip with his closest friends.
Gregory and his friends came down to Houston to have a good time, have a boys' weekend, and just enjoy themselves.
They rent a high-end rental in Houston, Texas, and prepare for a few days of R&R and social get-down.
But instead of enjoying a weekend savoring the sights and sounds of a new city, the group's dream vacation has just become a waking nightmare.
Police responded to a string of 911 calls and found Gregory Moore unresponsive and losing blood fast.
He has multiple gunshots, including his neck, his back, his arms, his chest.
His carotid artery was severed. His lung was punctured. Just horrible injuries.
He's clinging to life and barely has a pulse.
Paramedics rush Gregory to the nearest hospital, hoping for a miracle.
His life essentially at this moment is hanging in the balance.
In the summer of 2021, Brooklyn resident Gregory Moore was enjoying a weekend in Houston with his closest friends.
He's young, black, handsome, trying to be successful, trying to make it.
When Gregory Moore and his friends rented that Airbnb in the suburbs of Houston, they thought that they were going to have a fun, ritzy, exciting weekend.
But just 2 days into their trip, the group's vacation has just turned into a catastrophe.
One of his friends had called me, and he was hysterical. And he was like, Greg has been shot. That's it. Nothing else. I'm hundreds of miles away. I didn't know what to do.
En route to the hospital, first responders discover he's been shot at least 10 times.
For the whole night, I sat on the couch. And I just waited. And me and his mom were texting, and she was like, oh, he was in ICU and he was gonna live.
Meanwhile, as the sun comes up over Houston, homicide detectives arrive on the scene of the shooting to begin their investigation.
When I arrived at the scene, multiple patrol units were already there. They had detained numerous individuals that had been in the home. As I walked up, I observed there be a large amount of blood on the front porch.
They also saw shell casings on the ground from a 9mm. The front of the house was littered with bullets.
It's so shocking because it shows the rage that the gunman had.
It seems that the shooter ambushed the victim, rolled up, shot him, and then left.
Near the front door, investigators locate Gregory's cell phone, but that's not the only phone they find at the scene.
They find another cell phone and a tablet that looks like it's been run over.
They were in the street in front of the house.
It looks like this is some sort of physical evidence from the shooter.
Unfortunately, the investigators aren't able to access the devices.
These 2 additional devices are locked. And not only that, the tablet has been damaged.
Extracting all the digital contents of the phones, that takes months.
The detectives don't have that kind of time to waste.
If you have an armed shooter on the loose, you need answers now.
Why would someone want to hurt Gregory?
These people had just traveled here. They were tourists.
Gregory Moore is not from Houston, Texas. He's from New York, and so this doesn't make any sense.
That's when detectives are approached by a neighbor.
Hey, detectives. I have something I think you'll want to see.
The neighbor had a doorbell camera that picked up some useful footage.
He's able to share the video with them.
It's not the greatest quality of video, but detectives can see the shooter's vehicle arrive around 3 a.m., and it's a dark-colored sedan.
Seconds later, a barrage of gunshots ring out.
I also took a video when the gunshot stopped.
He recorded the end of this tragic evening.
On the phone video, you can see someone running away from the crime scene.
They jumped into the vehicle and pulled off. However, the cell phone video is too dark to identify exactly who this person is.
They aren't able to make out the vehicle's license plate from the video either.
As compelling as this evidence is, it doesn't do much to help the investigators narrow down their list of suspects.
We had no idea who the person was. Right now, we have to identify this guy.
However, before they can continue their investigation, Detective Crane receives a call from the hospital where Gregory is being treated.
Yes, this is Detective Crane.
They get a call that Gregory Moore has succumbed to his extensive injuries.
Gregory Moore was dead.
Houston detectives investigating the shooting of 28-year-old tourist Gregory Moore have just learned that he succumbed to his injuries.
He was pronounced deceased there at the hospital. It's a tragedy. It's the worst part of my job.
When the news spreads to Gregory's loved ones back in Brooklyn, they're devastated and confused.
And I remember just thinking to myself, like, this can't be happening. Not Greg. How? Why? I think in that moment, the air just left my body. My daughter had just graduated pre-K. And my son was going to kindergarten the following September. And I remember thinking to myself, how was I going to explain to them that he wasn't coming back?
Gregory had flown down to Houston with 3 friends, Raymond Gibbs, Clayton Barnes, and Troy Walsh. And the investigators' next move was to speak to them to see what they knew.
Gregory's friends are distraught when the detectives break the news to them.
Well, here's the deal. Gregory didn't make it, okay? So, we're gonna do what we can to figure out who and why, but it's gonna require some help from y'all, okay?
Gregory's friends are distraught. This was supposed to be a fun weekend in Houston.
They came all this way just to have a good time.
The detectives asked Greg's friends if they have any idea who the shooter was.
Is there anything you can think of that would help us in identifying?
The friends explain they'd only been in Houston for a couple of days.
We got out on Saturday around 3 o'clock. They went out Saturday night to have a good time.
Did y'all have any issues with anyone Saturday night?
No, we had no issues. Anyone.
In fact, Gregory's friends say he'd hit it off with someone at the bar that night.
We learned that the victim had met a female at a club the previous night, on Saturday night, the same night they arrived.
My friend met these girls, and I guess we were talking to them, and then I took one of the girls' number, he took one of the girls' number.
The woman Greg exchanged numbers with was named Stacy, and her friend Michelle exchanged numbers with Clayton.
They were doing what guys usually do: talk to girls, get girls, have a good time for the weekend.
The following night, Greg invited Stacy over to the rental house to keep the party going.
They were all just partying and having a good time. There was some more flirting happening between Greg and Stacy.
And eventually, Stacy suggested that they go pick up Michelle.
My friend wanted to come pretty much to the place, so we're like, okay. Greg asked me if I wanted to drive, and they're gonna come with me. I'm like, cool.
And so they left the Airbnb, traveling back down into Southwest Houston.
But along the way, their plans changed when Michelle decided to stay in for the night.
Our friend decided she wasn't coming anymore. Okay. We're like, all right, cool, whatever.
And that ultimately led to them turning around and driving back up to where the Airbnb was located.
By the time they made it back, Clayton was feeling hungry, so he decided he was going to go pick up something to eat.
We get back here, and I'm like, yo, I'm starving. They're like, all right, cool, we're gonna go inside and lay down. Okay. I'm like, that's cool. So I literally drive in the front to drop them off, and they walking.
Clayton says as Greg and Stacy approached the front door of the Airbnb, all hell broke loose.
That's when they are ambushed.
I see a guy just running from the side of the grass, and I see a little flashing light, and then all I heard was shots going off.
Clayton took cover and dialed 911.
Please, I'm okay. Hurry up, please.
Everyone knows what happened to Gregory, but where was Stacy?
The kids in the house did not know where the girl had gone. That caused us concern. We don't know who this girl is or what has happened to her.
There is not a last name, unfortunately.
Did she run away? Is she with the perpetrator?
So detectives start exploring all avenues to track Stacy down.
Stacy's friend Michelle was at the club with her the night she met Greg and his friends. Michelle and Clayton had exchanged numbers.
Clayton gives the police Michelle's number.
She agreed to come in and speak with them about this.
Thank you for coming in. You're welcome. We obviously want to talk to you about an incident that happened this morning early. Mm-hmm. And there's no sense in being all around the bush. Mm-hmm. Tell me what happened.
Michelle starts by confirming that she and her friend, Stacy Adams, went bar hopping on the night of June 27th.
We met some guys from New York. Everybody was having fun.
They find themselves on Saturday night at a club, having a good time. They think, oh, good, we got some people to hang out with.
And then they was Saturday, they was texting us like, do I want to come to the hospital?
Stacy was quick to accept the offer, but Michelle says she was more reluctant.
I already was like, no, because now I'm loving like this. And I just met them, but she was texting me like, come over here, it's fun.
At some point, Stacy told Michelle that she and the boys were on their way to pick her up.
I wouldn't answer my phone. I was trying to feel like I'm asleep because I ain't gonna go.
They ended up continuing the night without her.
But a little while later, Michelle says she heard from Stacy again.
Girl, I told you I'm not coming.
She called her at about 2:45 in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, panicking.
She was like,
Y'all can't tell on me, y'all can't tell on me. And we like, what you talking about? What's wrong?
That's when Stacy dropped a bombshell.
She was telling her, y'all have to alibi me out.
She was like, my dude killed someone who looked.
What?
Houston police investigating the murder of Gregory Moore had been looking for a young woman named Stacy Adams, who was with Greg during the shooting.
Initially, police were concerned that Stacy could be another victim of the crime, but now they have to consider the possibility she was in on it.
Now, in speaking with Stacy's friend, Michelle, that possibility seems more and more likely.
Michelle admitted her friend Stacy wasn't as single as she presented herself to be.
She indicated she received a very frantic phone call from Stacy, and she let her know that her boyfriend had shot and killed one of the guys they had met clubbing.
She was like, my dude killed someone who looked.
What?
I know, I'm freaking out.
According to Michelle, Stacy went on to explain that her boyfriend James had been spying on her that day.
Stacy's boyfriend found out she was messaging with Gregory. He was not happy about that.
His name James. I don't know his last name. I wish I knew it. He got a twin family. He screenshot the messages to her like you.
That's also how James found out where Stacy was.
The Instagram app allows you to share your location, so he can literally log into it and see on her locations where she is.
The boyfriend was able to track Stacy to where Gregory and his friends were staying by her social media. And when they get to the house, he jumps out, rolls up on the two of them.
She was like that. Her boyfriend took the dude, and he shot him at least like 5 times.
Come with me if you know what's good for you.
After the shots stopped, Stacy did leave the scene with her boyfriend.
Even though Michelle doesn't know James's full name, she's able to provide the investigators with other useful information.
She had a very good idea of where he lived, and through that information, we were able to determine what cars are registered at that address, which came back to matching the car that they fled the scene in.
DMV records show that the vehicle in question is registered to a 21-year-old pizza delivery driver named James Ray Lane.
They pull his driver's license photo and present it to Michelle.
You recognize who this person is?
That's James.
That's James.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, detectives have to wonder if the mysterious second cell phone they found at the crime scene belongs to James Lane.
In an effort to try to put all these pieces together, the detectives ring the phone number that they have for James Ray Lane. And the phone that they found at the house at the murder scene begins to ring.
Bingo.
With that, we were clearly able to establish that he was in fact there, and we got to a point where we were comfortable in that James Lane was in fact our suspect. And after we had a warrant for his arrest, then our tactical operations team then began the surveillance.
They start by staking out James's home.
Police set up surveillance. However, after several days, James does not show up and they are not able to locate Stacy either.
Next, the investigators go after their suspect's vehicle.
They learn that his vehicle is leased from a local car lot.
And when detectives contact the car lot, they're met with a shocking piece of information.
The dealership said he's here now. He's here now.
Houston police immediately move in to make the arrest.
Stacy was there with him too.
James was arrested. Stacy was just traveling with him, and she agreed to come to our office and talk to us about what happened.
At police headquarters, the investigators placed James and Stacy into separate interview rooms for questioning.
They decide that Stacy is the first person that they want to talk to.
We're not going to jump on off into here. Okay? And I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I do. The situation you're involved in, the truth is your best friend. Okay? Once you think about that, as we talk about what happened last weekend. Is that a fair approach?
Yeah.
As Stacy begins to tell her story, it lines up with what the detectives have already heard from other witnesses.
Saturday, I went out to this little bar. We got drunk, and I met some guys.
She and Michelle met the fellas from New York that night at a club.
So, with that, we got exchange numbers.
Stacy also confirms that she'd hung out with Gregory and his friends at their Airbnb the following night.
She admitted to, in fact, being there. She admitted to how she came to know the victim and his friends. But when we got to the real meat and potatoes of the shooting, she had a little different story about it.
This is what is real important. What happens? Okay?
She shared with us that she had no idea who the person was. He was masked up.
You do that on them.
Yeah? Okay. What do you say?
Nothing.
Stacy also denies leaving the scene of the crime with the shooter after he ceased fire.
What happened after the shooting?
I was in shock. And we went our separate ways.
What do you mean with your separate ways?
I left. I went to my house.
Yeah? Okay. And how did you leave?
We walked. My things out like in that area.
So she just walked away and went to her grandmother's house, who lived nearby, and then called people to come get her.
The detectives aren't buying it.
If you walk to your grandmother's house, give me your grandmother's name, her phone number, maybe even her address. Let's go talk to her, back up your alibi. But she couldn't.
Detectives also have the cell phone footage from the neighbor, which they believe shows Stacy getting in James's car and leaving with him.
There's also the fact that she told Michelle a very different story than what she's telling detectives now. Her current version of events just doesn't check out.
I just straight up confronted her with the fact that that's not true. That part of it is completely fabricated, and we're going to have to do better.
Okay, stop here.
Nope. Sometimes it takes a long time to get to the truth, but that's what we did here.
Police in Houston, Texas have zeroed in on 21-year-old James Ray Lane as their main suspect in the shooting death of Gregory Moore.
He was jealous. He was upset that his girlfriend, Stacy, might have been cheating on him, and he took it out on someone who didn't even know that she had a boyfriend.
But according to Stacy, James is innocent.
Stacy told the investigators that a man with a black mask shot Gregory Moore.
She said that she didn't know who the gunman was.
The investigators believe she's lying.
I share with her that if I don't believe it, a jury's not ever going to believe it either.
The truth is going to be very important for you right now. I sit here today, I mean, it could either make you a witness, to make you part of the crime, and to make you a suspect. So this is your opportunity to tell us the truth.
I always tell them, we understand sometimes things happen that are out of your control, but we can't make it worse by lying about it.
Finally, Stacy starts to break down.
Okay, stop here.
Nope.
Let me stop here.
Not at this point.
Sometimes it takes a long time to get to the truth in what we call the little ring, but we generally get there. And that's what we did here.
Stacy finally admits on the night she went home with Gregory, her boyfriend James was blowing up her phone.
Everything okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
A lot of them I was taking screenshots of my DMs and stuff. I was really ignoring him because I was having fun at that point. I don't want to argue with him. And he just kept calling and kept it.
She's getting text messages from James. He's wondering, where are you? Who are you with?
James had gotten into a tablet device that Stacy owned, and that was how he was able to access all her social media, the same tablet police found at the scene of the crime.
But Stacy insists she had no idea James was tracking her location.
I don't know. I didn't probably.
Stacy says when James ambushed them outside the Airbnb, she was just as shocked as Gregory.
James was clearly upset and jealous.
He beat on a defenseless man. Greg didn't have a knife. He didn't even have a pot to hit him with. He had nothing.
Why did you not talk to me though?
I was scared. I was still in shock. I didn't think that's what I said.
Come with me if you know what's good for you.
Stacy was in such shock that she actually did leave with James after the shooting.
I was going to stay with him until the police got there. But I was scared.
She says that James then dropped her off in an area of southwest Houston called Meyerland.
Okay, so you rode into Meyerland and just got out of the car on the street in Meyerland?
Yes, could I have people?
She was unsure as to where James went or where the murder weapon was.
But they get together a few days later and decide to lay low at her cousin's house in southwest Houston.
After doing that for a few more days, they make their way to the car dealership, hoping that they can get a new car and drive out of town. And it is at a car dealership that they get busted.
I have no problem. I think that would be a piece of problem.
But is she telling the truth?
Now the detectives make their way across the hall to talk to James to try to see if their stories will line up.
We don't have anybody dead about 2 years or something.
Houston detectives investigating the murder of Brooklyn native Gregory Moore have just taken a statement from 18-year-old Stacy Adams.
Stacy admitted to her boyfriend James being the gunman, but insisted she had no idea of what was going to go down.
Now, detectives are eager to hear James's side of the story.
There was a shooting that occurred, and this boy got killed. And I received information, a lot of information, that tells me you may have something to do with that. I'm going to give you an opportunity to tell us what happened.
Much to their surprise, he admits that he was on the scene.
What made you go there that night to the house where the shooting happened? That was my intention.
But James says after he showed up and found Stacy, the situation quickly got out of hand.
According to James, when he arrived, he told Stacy, "Let's go."
Come on.
I told her, let's go.
What you think you're doing? Take my girl back home. your hands off me.
What do you mean you came at me?
And he indicates Gregory attacked him. He said he did what he needed to do in order to defend himself.
That's why he shot Gregory.
Unfortunately for James, the detectives know he's not being truthful.
James told the police, basically, he felt threatened by Gregory Moore. He had the 9mm. He shot Gregory Moore 10 times, killed a man. And so it's astounding that he would try to shift the blame.
Well, James, let me stop you. Don't start going down a path of lying, all right?
I just lay out to him, these are the facts. This is what we know, and this is your opportunity to tell us what happened.
You're gonna have to tell us what happened without some crazy story that doesn't make sense and it's not consistent with the evidence, okay? What do you want me to say? I want you to tell me the truth. Yeah, I'm telling you the truth.
After a little bit of time, he comes around to the most self-serving truth he can get to, and he asked me and my partner, what would you do if you saw someone handling your woman that way? I asked him to elaborate on that, and he wouldn't. But he put himself there, and then he put himself trying to justify the murder. And that was sufficient enough for us.
At the end of the interview, the investigators charged James with the murder of Gregory Moore.
I would like to have had a complete total confession as to why he did it, but that's very hard for a lot of people to do.
Investigators conclude that James's girlfriend, Stacy Adams, was an innocent bystander in the crime.
Detectives do believe that Stacy is telling the truth about not knowing what James was going to do that night.
They ended up not charging her with any crime.
However, as prosecutors prepare for trial, they aren't planning to go easy on James.
Making the decision to drive 40 minutes all the way up to North Harris County and wait, lay in waiting for them to return. It's a passion-fueled, jealousy-fueled, immaturity-fueled crime.
This was not an act of self-defense. This was a cold, calculated murder.
James is now facing life in prison. Having an acquittal just seems highly unlikely.
So he decides to come to the table with the prosecutors to try to strike a deal to save some part of his life.
James finally confesses to investigators' version of events and admits to gunning down Gregory Moore in cold blood.
In exchange for a full confession, they do offer James a deal of 22 years, and he does accept this plea deal.
He's got to serve at least half of that before he can even be considered for parole.
For Gregory Moore's loved ones, the resolution in this case isn't enough.
James got 22 years. 22. In 22 years, James will still be old enough to have a family, to have children, to have a life.
This sentence is quite light, but James is 21 years old and has never so much as gotten a traffic ticket.
It's really heartbreaking because prosecutors even said after the sentencing, he never showed remorse to the victim's family. He never showed that he felt bad for the situation.
Gregory Moore should be alive today, enjoying his kids growing up. James Lane should be in the free world today, doing what kids his age should be doing. And neither one of those things are going to happen now.
Greg didn't have cancer. He wasn't in a car accident. He wasn't hit by a bus. He was shot. And that's a hard pill for me to swallow.
No one thinks this is going to happen to them, when they are traveling. Maybe someone steals your wallet, but you certainly do not lose your life because you decide to give someone your phone number.
I often wonder, when he was laying there, like, was he scared? Was he regretful? No, I hope where he's at is peaceful. I hope that he's in a beautiful place far than where we are. And I hope he's looking down on us because we miss him something terrible down here.
On the evening of February 16th, Sill 1974, Fort Worth, Texas, looked much like countless other American cities during a decade marked by rapid growth, changing social norms, and a rising public awareness of violent crime. The city had become one of the largest urban centers in North Texas, its neighborhoods connected by expanding highways and surrounded by shopping centers, restaurants, and entertainment venues that drew thousands of residents every weekend. For many families, Saturday nights were ordinary occasions filled with high school dates, movies, and plans for the future. Few imagined that one such evening would become the beginning of a homicide investigation that would remain unresolved for nearly half a century. Among the young people enjoying that weekend was Carla Jan Walker, a 17-year-old senior at Western Hills High School. Friends and classmates described her as outgoing, dependable, and active in school life. Like many teenagers approaching graduation, she was looking ahead to adulthood while still enjoying the routines of high school. Those who knew her remembered her as someone with a close circle of friends and a steady relationship with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. That Saturday evening, Carla and Rodney attended the Valentine's dance at Western Hills High School. The event was one of the school's major social gatherings of the year, bringing together students for an evening of music and celebration. Numerous classmates later confirmed seeing the couple together throughout the dance. Nothing about the evening appeared unusual. There were no reports of arguments, suspicious encounters, or behavior suggesting that either teenager believed they were in danger. After leaving the dance, Carla and Rodney drove to the parking lot of the Ridgely Bowling Center, a location where teenagers often gathered after school events. The bowling alley was well known in Fort Worth and served as an informal meeting place during weekends. It was common for young couples to remain in the parking lot talking before heading home. According to Rodney's later statements to investigators, the two were sitting inside his automobile shortly after midnight when an unknown man suddenly approached the vehicle. The attacker was armed with a handgun and immediately took control of the situation. Rodney later described the encounter as unfolding extremely quickly. The gunman ordered him out of the car and physically assaulted him. During the struggle, Rodney suffered severe head injuries after being struck repeatedly. Despite being injured, Rodney remained conscious long enough to witness portions of the attack. He later reported that the gunman forced Carla into another vehicle before driving away. Unable to stop the abduction, Rodney sought help as quickly as he could. Emergency responders and law enforcement were notified almost immediately. For investigators arriving at the bowling alley, the case initially appeared to be an armed kidnapping. Officers secured the parking lot, interviewed Rodney, and searched for evidence left behind by the assailant. At that time, forensic science differed dramatically from the techniques available decades later. DNA profiling had not yet been developed. Crime scene investigators relied heavily on fingerprints, eyewitness testimony, physical impressions, fibers, blood typing, and conventional laboratory analysis. Within hours, law enforcement agencies across North Texas began searching for Carla and the unknown suspect. Patrol officers monitored roads and highways, while detectives interviewed witnesses who had been present near the bowling alley that evening. Authorities appealed to the public for information through newspapers, television broadcasts, and radio reports. The following day, the investigation changed dramatically. On February 17th, Sill 1974, Carla Walker's body was discovered in a secluded area near Benbrook Lake, southwest of Fort Worth. Investigators determined that she had been murdered. The discovery transformed what had begun as a kidnapping investigation into a homicide case that immediately shocked the local community. The crime scene was carefully processed using the forensic methods available in 1974. Detectives collected clothing, biological evidence, fibers, photographs, and other physical materials that they believed might eventually identify the offender. Every item was cataloged and preserved according to the standards of the period. Although investigators could not have known it at the time, some of the evidence collected that day would remain stored for decades before scientific advances finally revealed its significance. The investigation quickly expanded beyond Fort Worth. Detectives considered whether the offender might have traveled across county lines or committed similar crimes elsewhere in Texas. Hundreds of interviews were conducted during the early weeks of the investigation. Friends, relatives, classmates, employees at nearby businesses, and individuals known to frequent the bowling alley were questioned. Rodney McCoy, as the surviving eyewitness, became one of the investigation's most important sources of information. Detectives interviewed him extensively regarding the attack, the appearance of the gunman, and every detail he could remember despite his injuries. His account consistently described a sudden armed assault carried out by a stranger. Investigators found no evidence suggesting that Rodney had been involved in Carla's disappearance or death. Attention also turned toward identifying the vehicle used during the abduction. Witnesses attempted to recall automobiles seen leaving the parking lot around the relevant time, but descriptions varied and none produced an immediate breakthrough. Without surveillance, cameras, digital records, or cell phone data, detectives depended almost entirely upon eyewitness memory. As days turned into weeks, the initial surge of investigative leads began slowing. Reports from the public were carefully evaluated. Some tips appeared promising, but ultimately proved unrelated. Others could not be verified. Detectives followed every reasonable possibility, recognizing that the first days after a violent crime often offered the greatest opportunity to identify an unknown offender. Throughout Texas, newspapers covered the investigation extensively. Carla Walker's murder became one of the region's most closely watched criminal cases. Parents expressed growing concern about public safety. Schools discussed precautions with students. Community members who had previously considered locations like bowling alleys to be safe gathering places questioned whether random violence could strike anyone. During the mid-1970s, law enforcement agencies across the United States faced increasing numbers of stranger abduction cases, many occurring before modern forensic databases existed. Communication between jurisdictions often depended upon mailed reports, telephone calls, and personal contacts among investigators. While experienced detectives worked tirelessly, technological limitations frequently delayed or prevented connections between crimes committed in different regions. The Carla Walker investigation reflected those broader challenges. Detectives possessed physical evidence but lacked the scientific tools needed to extract its full value. Fingerprints remained useful only if a suspect could be identified for comparison. Blood evidence could establish limited characteristics but not individual identity. Biological samples capable of solving the crime decades later remained silent because the technology simply did not yet exist. Despite these limitations, investigators refused to abandon the case. Files expanded as every interview, laboratory report, photograph, and map was preserved. The detectives believed that one overlooked clue or one future witness might eventually provide the answer. Years passed. The homicide remained open. New detectives inherited the investigation as personnel retired or transferred. Each generation reviewed the evidence collected in 1974, attempting to identify missed opportunities or unexplored leads. Advances in forensic science occasionally allowed certain items to be re-examined, although many early techniques still offered limited results. Meanwhile, Carla Walker's family continued seeking answers. Like countless families affected by unsolved homicides, they lived with decades of uncertainty. Public attention gradually shifted toward newer crimes, yet investigators continued preserving the case files and evidence rather than closing the investigation entirely. Across the United States, the late 20th century witnessed one of the most significant revolutions in criminal investigation, the emergence of DNA profiling. Beginning in the 1980s and expanding rapidly during the following decades, forensic laboratories acquired the ability to identify individuals through genetic material recovered from crime scenes. Cases previously considered unsolvable suddenly became candidates for renewed investigation. Evidence collected years earlier, sometimes decades earlier, could now be analyzed using methods unimaginable when detectives first examined it. Biological samples, once viewed as inconclusive, became powerful sources of identification. Cold case units increasingly reopened investigations that had resisted every traditional investigative technique. Among those preserved files sat the evidence from Carla Walker's murder. For years it remained carefully stored, protected against deterioration, waiting for scientific capabilities to catch up with the questions investigators had asked since February 1974. Detectives who originally collected that evidence could not have predicted how dramatically forensic science would change. Yet their decision to preserve every available item ensured that future investigators would inherit more than paper reports. They would inherit the possibility that one day, after decades of unanswered questions, science might finally speak where witnesses could not. By the spring of 1974, investigators with the Fort Worth Police Department had accumulated hundreds of pages of reports related to the murder of Carla Walker. Detectives had documented witness interviews, processed physical evidence from both the Ridge Blair Bowling Center parking lot and the location where Carla's body had been discovered, and followed every lead that appeared remotely credible. Despite the extensive effort, the central question remained unanswered. Who was the armed man who abducted Carla Walker after the Valentine's dance? At the center of the investigation was the testimony of Rodney McCoy, Carla's boyfriend and the only known eyewitness to the abduction. Investigators interviewed Rodney multiple times during the weeks that followed. His injuries, sustained when the attacker repeatedly struck him with a handgun, were consistent with his account of a violent assault. Detectives carefully compared each statement he gave over time, looking for inconsistencies that might suggest confusion or deception. Instead, they found that his description of the incident remained largely consistent despite the trauma he had experienced. Rodney explained that the attack happened within moments. While the couple sat inside his automobile in the parking lot of Ridgely Bowling Center shortly after midnight, an armed stranger unexpectedly approached. The gunman displayed a handgun, ordered Rodney out of the vehicle, and quickly established complete control over the situation. Rodney resisted, and the attacker responded by striking him repeatedly with the weapon. During the assault, Carla was forced into another vehicle before the assailant fled the scene. Because Rodney had been focused on surviving the attack itself, he could provide only a limited description of the offender. He described the gunman as a white male and offered investigators every detail he could remember regarding the man's appearance, clothing, approximate height, and build. The detectives also questioned him extensively about the suspect's vehicle. While Rodney recalled certain general characteristics, the encounter had unfolded so rapidly that no complete license plate number or uniquely identifying feature could be provided. Those limitations proved significant. In 1974, there were no surveillance cameras overlooking the parking lot, no digital records documenting vehicles entering or leaving the area, and no mobile phone location data capable of reconstructing movements. Investigators depended almost entirely upon eyewitness observations and physical evidence collected from the crime scenes. Detectives immediately began canvassing businesses surrounding the bowling alley, employees working late shifts, customers leaving nearby establishments, and residents living in adjacent neighborhoods were interviewed in hopes that someone had noticed an unfamiliar vehicle or suspicious individual. While several witnesses reported seeing automobiles entering or leaving the parking lot around the relevant time, none could confidently identify one as connected to the crime. Law enforcement also explored whether Carla or Rodney had been specifically targeted. Friends, classmates, teachers, relatives, and acquaintances were questioned about their relationships, routines, and any recent conflicts. Investigators searched for evidence that Carla had received threats or that someone had developed an unhealthy fixation on her. Likewise, detectives considered whether Rodney himself might have been the intended target. Despite extensive interviews, no credible evidence emerged suggesting that either teenager had known their attacker. Attention then shifted toward offenders with histories of violent crimes in the Fort Worth area. Detectives reviewed reports involving armed robberies, assaults, kidnappings, and sexual offenses committed before February 1974. Individuals recently released from prison or under parole supervision were identified and, where appropriate, interviewed or investigated further. Some became temporary persons of interest before being eliminated through alibis or lack of supporting evidence. Meanwhile, forensic specialists continued examining every piece of physical evidence recovered during the investigation. Crime laboratory capabilities in the mid-1970s focused primarily on fingerprint comparison, blood typing, microscopic hair and fiber analysis, and the examination of physical trace materials. Biological evidence could establish certain characteristics, such as blood groups, but it could not uniquely identify a specific individual. Consequently, evidence that would later prove invaluable remained scientifically incomplete at the time. Detectives preserved clothing, fibers, biological samples, photographs, and laboratory reports with exceptional care. Standard evidence procedures required every item to be documented, labeled, and securely stored. While these practices were routine, they ultimately became one of the investigation's greatest strengths. The decision to retain evidence rather than discard it ensured that future forensic technologies could eventually revisit the case. As weeks became months, investigators continued receiving information from the public. Newspaper coverage prompted citizens to report suspicious individuals, unusual vehicles, and rumors circulating throughout Fort Worth. Every tip required evaluation. The detectives traveled throughout Texas, following leads that occasionally appeared promising but repeatedly ended without identifying the offender. One recurring challenge involved eyewitness reliability. Human memory naturally changes over time, particularly following stressful events or after exposure to media coverage. Detectives therefore attempted to verify every witness statement independently whenever possible. Information that could not be corroborated was carefully documented but treated cautiously. By the end of 1974, the investigation had generated an extensive case file without producing sufficient evidence to identify or arrest a suspect. Rather than closing the investigation, Fort Worth detectives formally classified the homicide as an active, unsolved case. Periodically, investigators reopened specific lines of inquiry whenever new information became available. During the following years, the Walker family remained in regular contact with law enforcement. Like many families affected by unsolved homicides, they sought updates whenever detectives reviewed evidence or received new leads. Although investigators could rarely provide definitive answers, communication between the family and the police continued as the case remained open. The broader criminal justice landscape was also evolving. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, forensic laboratories introduced increasingly sophisticated methods for comparing trace evidence. Hair examinations became more standardized, fiber analysis improved, and serological testing expanded investigators' ability to classify biological material. Even so, these techniques still lack the ability to identify one individual with the level of certainty later achieved through DNA profiling. As new detectives joined the Fort Worth Police Department, responsibility for the Walker investigation gradually transferred from one generation of investigators to another. Each detective inherited thousands of pages of reports along with preserved evidence collected in February 1974. Fresh reviews occasionally identified investigative opportunities that earlier teams had not pursued, leading to additional interviews and renewed examinations of existing evidence. Cold case investigations often rely upon this process of periodic reassessment. Investigators revisit witness statements, compare old reports against newer crimes, and examine whether technological advances permit additional laboratory testing. The Carla Walker investigation followed this pattern. Although no immediate breakthrough occurred, the case was never abandoned. Nationally, law enforcement agencies were beginning to appreciate the long-term value of preserving physical evidence. High-profile unsolved cases demonstrated that items collected decades earlier could become relevant as scientific techniques advanced. This shift encouraged agencies to maintain evidence whenever practical, even in investigations that had grown inactive. One of the most significant scientific developments arrived during the mid-1980s with the introduction of DNA profiling, initially available only in limited circumstances. The technology demonstrated that biological material recovered from crime scenes could identify individuals with extraordinary precision. As laboratories refined testing methods, investigators across the United States recognized that numerous cold cases might eventually be solved using evidence collected years before. However, widespread implementation took time. Early DNA testing required relatively large, well-preserved samples, and many crime laboratories lacked immediate access to the technology. Funding limitations, laboratory backlogs, and evolving scientific standards meant that numerous older investigations, including Carlo Walker's, continued waiting while forensic science advanced. Throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, improvements in DNA extraction and analysis dramatically expanded what laboratories could accomplish. Scientists developed techniques capable of analyzing increasingly small or degraded biological samples. Evidence previously considered unsuitable for testing suddenly became viable. Recognizing these advances, cold case investigators across Texas began reviewing unsolved homicides involving preserved biological evidence. The Walker case naturally attracted renewed attention because investigators knew potentially significant forensic material had been retained since 1974. Before submitting decades-old evidence for modern DNA analysis, investigators first evaluated its condition. Evidence storage records were examined to confirm that items had remained properly preserved and that chain of custody documentation remained intact. Maintaining an unbroken chain of custody was essential because any future prosecution would require demonstrating that evidence had been securely maintained from the original investigation through contemporary laboratory testing. At the same time, detectives reviewed every suspect previously considered during the original investigation. Many had died, relocated, or been eliminated years earlier. Others remained unidentified individuals mentioned only briefly in witness interviews. Investigators understood that if modern forensic testing produced a DNA profile, they would need reliable comparison samples from potential suspects. By the early 21st century, the investigation had entered a new phase. Instead of relying primarily upon eyewitness recollections, detectives increasingly focused on scientific evidence preserved from the original crime scene. Advances in forensic biology offered possibilities unavailable to investigators in 1974. Yet obtaining a DNA profile represented only the first challenge. Even if a profile could be developed, identifying the individual behind it would require additional investigative work, particularly if that person's DNA was absent from criminal databases. For decades, the evidence collected during the first days after Carlo Walker's murder had remained carefully stored in police property rooms. Those sealed packages represented more than historical artifacts from an unsolved investigation. They contained biological material that had outlived changing investigative methods, retiring detectives, and evolving forensic science. As technology continued advancing, investigators increasingly believed that the answers sought since February 1974 might no longer depend upon fading memories or forgotten witness accounts, but upon microscopic genetic evidence that had silently waited nearly half a century for science to catch up with the crime. As the decades passed, the investigation into Carlo Walker's murder became what law enforcement classifies as a cold case investigation that remains open but lacks active investigative leads. Contrary to popular belief, a cold case is not considered closed. Detectives continue to review evidence, evaluate new information, and apply advances in forensic science whenever opportunities arise. For Carlo Walker's family, however, the passing years meant living with unanswered questions, while hoping that each new scientific development might bring investigators closer to identifying the person responsible. During the 1980s and 1990s, homicide investigations across the United States were transformed by developments in forensic biology. DNA profiling, first introduced in criminal investigations during the mid-1980s, demonstrated that biological material recovered from crime scenes could identify individuals with an unprecedented level of certainty. Initially, The technology was limited to relatively fresh and well-preserved samples, but continuous improvements gradually expanded its usefulness for older investigations. The Fort Worth Police Department monitored these developments closely. Detectives responsible for unsolved homicides recognized that evidence collected in the 1970s might eventually become suitable for DNA analysis. As forensic laboratories introduced increasingly sensitive testing methods, investigators periodically reviewed whether the evidence preserved from Carla Walker's murder could benefit from new examination. One of the strengths of the original investigation was the careful preservation of physical evidence. Detectives in 1974 had documented the collection of clothing, biological material, photographs, laboratory reports, and numerous other exhibits according to the standards of the time. Although they had no way of anticipating modern DNA technology, their commitment to preserving evidence meant that future investigators inherited materials that remained scientifically valuable decades later. Throughout the 1990s, laboratory techniques continued evolving. Polymerase chain reaction, PCR, methods allowed scientists to analyze significantly smaller quantities of DNA than had previously been possible. Improvements in contamination control, extraction procedures, and statistical interpretation further increased the reliability of forensic testing. These advances encouraged cold case investigators nationwide to revisit evidence that earlier laboratories had been unable to examine successfully. Even with improved technology, reopening an old homicide required considerable preparation. Before evidence could be submitted for additional testing, detectives carefully reviewed original reports to verify the chain of custody. Every transfer of evidence from the crime scene to the property room, from storage to laboratory examination, and back again, had to be documented. Maintaining this uninterrupted record ensured confidence that the items being tested decades later were the same items collected during the original investigation. Investigators also reassessed the original witness interviews. Although memories naturally fade over time, older statements occasionally become more meaningful when viewed alongside new forensic findings. Detectives compared reports prepared in 1974 with interviews conducted during later reviews, searching for overlooked consistencies or investigative opportunities that had not seemed significant at the time. Meanwhile, criminal databases expanded dramatically. The creation of the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, enabled laboratories to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes with profiles obtained from convicted offenders and, later, from individuals arrested for certain offenses in many jurisdictions. Detectives hoped that if a usable DNA profile could be developed from evidence in the Walker investigation, a comparison through available databases might identify a suspect. However, obtaining a DNA profile represented only the first step. Success depended upon recovering sufficient biological material from evidence that had been stored for decades. Environmental exposure, handling practices common in the 1970s, and natural degradation could all affect the quality of genetic material. Consequently, forensic scientists approached older evidence cautiously, using specialized procedures designed to maximize the chances of obtaining reliable results while minimizing the risk of contamination. By the early 2000s, many police departments across the United States had established dedicated cold case units or assigned experienced investigators to review unsolved homicides systematically. These units often combine traditional detective work with modern forensic science, recognizing that either approach alone might be insufficient. The Carla Walker investigation benefited from this broader national emphasis on revisiting long unsolved violent crimes. As detectives revisited the file, they also examined whether advances in offender profiling, geographic analysis, or computerized records might reveal patterns that had been impossible to identify decades earlier. Records that once required manual searches could now be reviewed electronically. Investigators compared the Walker homicide with other unsolved crimes in Texas and neighboring states, looking for similarities in offender behavior, victim selection, or methods of operation. While these reviews produced valuable analytical insights, none identified a suspect with sufficient certainty to justify prosecution. Throughout these years, investigators remained mindful of an important principle in criminal investigations. Scientific evidence is most powerful when interpreted alongside traditional investigative work. DNA can establish that a person's biological material was present, but detectives must still determine how and why it came to be there. Consequently, even as forensic technology improved, investigators continued interviewing witnesses, reviewing historical records, and examining every credible lead that emerged. The rise of investigative genetic genealogy during the late 2010s represented another major development. Unlike traditional DNA database searches, which compare crime scene profiles against law enforcement databases containing convicted offenders or arrestees, investigative genetic genealogy compares crime scene DNA to voluntarily submitted profiles from individuals using genealogy services for family history research. By identifying distant biological relatives, genealogists can assist investigators in constructing family trees that may eventually lead to an unknown suspect. This approach gained international attention following the identification and arrest of the individual known as the Golden State Killer in 2018. After that case demonstrated the effectiveness of investigative genetic genealogy, law enforcement agencies across the United States began evaluating whether the same methodology might assist in other long-standing investigations. The Fort Worth Police Department reviewed the Carla Walker case within this changing investigative landscape. Detectives determined that preserved biological evidence might now be suitable not only for conventional DNA analysis, but also, if necessary and legally appropriate, for advanced genealogical techniques. Partnerships with forensic laboratories and specialized experts became increasingly important as investigators prepared evidence for modern testing. Before such testing could proceed, forensic scientists first assessed whether sufficient DNA remained on the preserved evidence. Samples were carefully examined using methods designed to recover even highly degraded genetic material. The process required patience, precision, and strict laboratory protocols to prevent contamination. Every analytical step was documented because any eventual prosecution would require confidence that the scientific conclusions were reliable and reproducible. As laboratory work progressed, detectives simultaneously revisited historical investigative files. They reviewed reports concerning persons of interest considered during previous decades, evaluated whether any had since been convicted of other violent crimes, and determined whether referenced DNA samples might be available for comparison through lawful means. Although many names had appeared in the case file over the years, none had been supported by sufficient evidence to warrant criminal charges. The Walker investigation illustrated the evolving relationship between science and detective work. Earlier investigators had preserved evidence without knowing what future technologies might reveal. Modern investigators inherited not only the physical exhibits, but also decades of careful documentation describing where each item originated and how it had been handled. Without that meticulous record-keeping, even the most advanced laboratory techniques would have had limited value. Cold case investigations often progress slowly because each step must withstand future judicial scrutiny. Detectives cannot rely upon assumptions or incomplete documentation. Every laboratory result must be interpreted within the broader factual context established by witness interviews, crime scene examinations, and historical investigative records. In the Walker case, that careful approach ensured that scientific advances would strengthen, not replace, the traditional investigative foundation established in 1974. By the late 2010s, the investigation had reached a point unimaginable when Carla Walker disappeared. Evidence collected nearly half a century earlier was being examined using technologies unavailable to the original detectives. Investigators understood that they were closer than ever to answering questions that had persisted since February 1974. Yet they also recognized that identifying a DNA profile would not automatically resolve the case. Confirming the identity of the individual associated with that profile would require additional investigation, corroborating evidence, and adherence to established legal procedures before any arrest could occur. For nearly 5 decades, the case had endured because investigators refused to discard evidence or abandon the possibility that future science might provide answers. As forensic laboratories completed increasingly sophisticated analyses, the preserved biological evidence from Carla Walker's murder was no longer viewed simply as an exhibit from an old case file. It had become the central focus of an investigation entering its most scientifically significant phase since the crime was first reported in 1974. By the late 2010s, nearly 45 years had passed since Carla Walker was abducted from the parking lot of the Ridgely Bowling Center. During those decades, investigators had preserved thousands of pages of reports and numerous pieces of physical evidence, even as many of the original detectives retired. What had changed most dramatically was not the evidence itself, but the scientific methods available to examine it. The investigation increasingly focused on whether modern DNA analysis could produce information that had been unattainable in 1974. The first step was to determine whether biological evidence retained from the original investigation could yield a suitable DNA profile. Forensic scientists carefully evaluated preserved exhibits using contemporary laboratory procedures designed for aged and potentially degraded samples. Unlike earlier forensic methods, which required relatively large amounts of biological material, modern techniques could often recover usable DNA from much smaller samples while minimizing contamination. Laboratory personnel followed strict quality control protocols throughout the testing process. Each stage, from evidence handling and extraction to amplification and profile interpretation, was documented in detail. This documentation was essential because any future criminal prosecution would require confidence that the testing met accepted scientific standards and that the resulting DNA profile accurately reflected material recovered from the evidence. The laboratory work ultimately succeeded in producing a DNA profile believed to belong to the unknown perpetrator. For investigators, this represented the most significant forensic development since the original homicide investigation began. After decades without a viable suspect, detectives now possessed biological evidence capable of being compared against modern databases. The profile was first evaluated through conventional law enforcement DNA databases, including systems designed to compare crime scene profiles with those of convicted offenders and other legally eligible individuals. According to public accounts of the investigation, those searches did not immediately identify a matching individual. The absence of a database match indicated that the unknown contributor's DNA was either not present in the available law enforcement databases or could not be associated with an existing profile. At that point, investigators considered an approach that had recently become an important tool in solving certain long unsolved violent crimes: investigative genetic genealogy. Investigative genetic genealogy differs from traditional forensic DNA comparisons. Rather than searching only criminal justice databases, the technique uses specially prepared DNA profiles suitable for comparison with publicly accessible or lawfully authorized genealogy databases whose users have chosen to make their information available for such purposes. When distant biological relatives are identified, professional genealogists can construct family trees that help investigators narrow the pool of possible individuals. The Fort Worth Police Department worked with forensic specialists and genealogical experts experienced in this emerging investigative method. Their objective was not to identify a suspect directly through genealogy, but to identify biological relatives whose family connections could eventually lead investigators toward the unknown contributor of the crime scene DNA. The process required extensive historical research. Genealogists examined birth records, marriage records, census information, obituaries, military records, newspaper archives, and other publicly available documents. Each potential family connection had to be carefully verified before investigators could confidently narrow the number of possible individuals. Unlike television portrayals of forensic investigations, genetic genealogy is rarely a rapid process. Building family trees may involve tracing multiple generations across different states, resolving conflicting historical records, and distinguishing between individuals with similar names. Investigators repeatedly compared genealogical findings with known facts from the criminal investigation, including the offender's likely age, geographic location, and opportunity to have committed the crime. As genealogical analysis progressed, investigators gradually reduced the number of potential candidates. Rather than producing a single name immediately, the research identified family groups whose genetic relationships were consistent with the crime scene DNA profile. The detectives then combined those findings with traditional investigative techniques. Historical records became especially important during this phase. Investigators examined where individuals had lived in February 1974, whether they had connections to Fort Worth, whether they matched the general physical description provided during the original investigation, and whether other evidence supported or contradicted their possible involvement. Genealogy alone could not establish criminal responsibility. It served as an investigative lead that required independent corroboration. Eventually, detectives focused their attention on Glenn Samuel McCurley, a man who had lived in the Fort Worth area during the period of Carla Walker's murder. Publicly available court records indicate that McCurley had served in the military and had been in his early 20s at the time of the crime. Investigators determined that his background and location during the relevant period warranted additional investigation. Even after identifying McCurley as a potential suspect, investigators did not immediately seek an arrest warrant. Consistent with accepted investigative practice, they sought direct confirmation that his DNA matched the biological profile recovered from the preserved evidence. To accomplish this, detectives conducted surveillance designed to lawfully obtain a discarded item that could provide a reference DNA sample. Collection of abandoned property for DNA comparison has become a common investigative technique in jurisdictions where it is legally authorized. Individuals frequently discard items such as beverage containers, utensils, tissues, or other objects that may contain biological material. Once abandoned in a public setting, such items can sometimes be collected by investigators without the individual's knowledge, subject to applicable laws and judicial precedent. According to investigators, a discarded item associated with McCurley was recovered and submitted for forensic analysis. Scientists compared the DNA profile obtained from that item with the profile previously developed from evidence preserved in the Carla Walker investigation. The comparison produced what investigators regarded as a significant result. According to public court records, forensic analysts concluded that the DNA obtained from McCurley was consistent with the DNA profile developed from evidence collected during the homicide investigation. Statistical analysis accompanying the laboratory findings indicated an extremely strong level of support for the conclusion that the DNA originated from McCurley rather than from an unrelated individual. Although the DNA comparison represented a major investigative milestone, detectives continued assembling corroborating evidence before seeking criminal charges. They reviewed historical records documenting McCurley's whereabouts in 1974, examined previous investigative reports, and prepared a comprehensive affidavit summarizing both the original investigation and the modern forensic findings. Cold case prosecutions present unique challenges because decades often separate the crime from the arrest. Witnesses may have died, memories may have faded, and physical locations may have changed substantially. Consequently, prosecutors and investigators seek to develop the strongest possible evidentiary record before filing charges. Scientific evidence, historical documentation, and surviving witness testimony must be carefully integrated into a coherent presentation suitable for judicial review. The Walker investigation demonstrated how advances in forensic science could complement, not replace, traditional investigative work. The original detectives' careful preservation of evidence made modern DNA testing possible. Contemporary forensic scientists developed a reliable genetic profile. Genealogists narrowed the field of potential individuals. Detectives then verified those findings through conventional investigation and direct DNA comparison. Each stage depended upon the work completed during the previous one. By 2020, investigators believed they had assembled sufficient evidence to identify the person responsible for Carla Walker's murder. Nearly 46 years had passed since the original crime. Throughout that period, The preserved evidence had remained available, awaiting technologies that did not exist when the investigation began. For the Walker family, the scientific developments represented something that had seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing decade: measurable progress toward identifying the offender. For law enforcement, the case became an illustration of the value of preserving evidence indefinitely, maintaining complete investigative records, and periodically reviewing unsolved homicides as forensic capabilities evolve. The investigation had now progressed from an unidentified DNA profile to a specific individual supported by both genealogical analysis and direct forensic comparison. The remaining steps would shift from investigation to the legal process, where prosecutors would evaluate the evidence, present it to the court, and determine whether the decades-old homicide could finally proceed toward trial under contemporary standards of criminal justice. After investigators obtained a DNA profile from evidence preserved since 1974 and developed Glenn Samuel McCurley as a suspect through investigative genetic genealogy and subsequent forensic comparison, the focus of the Carla Walker investigation shifted from identifying an unknown offender to determining whether the accumulated evidence satisfied the legal standard required for criminal prosecution. In a case that had remained unsolved for more than 4 decades, every investigative decision was subject to careful review because the evidence would eventually be scrutinized in court. The detectives from the Fort Worth Police Department worked closely with prosecutors from the Tarrant County Criminal District Attorney's Office to evaluate the evidence collected throughout the investigation. Prosecutors examined not only the newly obtained DNA evidence, but also the original investigative reports, witness statements, forensic records, photographs, laboratory documentation, and chain of custody records that had been maintained since February 1974. One of the primary strengths of the case was the continuity of documentation. Although many years had passed, investigators had preserved detailed records describing where evidence had been collected, who had handled it, when laboratory examinations had occurred, and how the items had been stored. Maintaining this uninterrupted chain of custody was essential because it allowed prosecutors to demonstrate that the biological evidence tested in modern laboratories originated from the original crime scene and had not been altered or substituted. The DNA evidence itself represented a major advancement over the investigative tools available in 1974. According to public court records, forensic scientists compared the DNA profile recovered from preserved evidence with the DNA obtained from the discarded item associated with McCurley. The resulting comparison produced an extremely strong statistical association, supporting investigators' conclusion that the DNA belonged to McCurley rather than to an unrelated individual. While DNA evidence can provide powerful identification, prosecutors also sought corroborating information from the historical investigation. They reviewed Rodney McCoy's eyewitness account of the abduction, contemporary reports describing the sequence of events, and evidence establishing the timeline of Carla Walker's disappearance. These historical records remained important because successful homicide prosecutions generally rely upon multiple forms of evidence that support one another. Investigators also reviewed McCurley's known history and whereabouts during the relevant period. Publicly available information established that he had been living in the Fort Worth area in 1974, placing him within the geographic region where the crime occurred. Detectives evaluated employment records, residential information, and other available documentation to determine whether any information contradicted the developing case. According to public reports, investigators found no evidence that excluded him from consideration. By early 2020, investigators concluded that the accumulated evidence established probable cause to seek criminal charges. On February 21, SIL 2020, nearly 46 years after Carla Walker's murder, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested and charged with murder. The arrest marked the first time anyone had been formally accused in connection with the case. The announcement received significant national media attention because it illustrated the increasing role of forensic science in resolving decades-old investigations. Law enforcement officials emphasized that the breakthrough resulted from the combination of evidence preservation, advances in DNA analysis, investigative genetic genealogy, and traditional detective work rather than from any single investigative technique. For Carla Walker's surviving family members, the arrest represented the first substantial legal development since 1974. Although an arrest does not determine guilt, it signaled that investigators believed sufficient evidence existed to present the case before the judicial system. Following the arrest, McCurley was processed through the criminal justice system in accordance with Texas law. As in every criminal prosecution, he was presumed innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in court. Prosecutors therefore prepared to present the evidence while defense counsel evaluated the investigative methods, forensic testing, and legal issues surrounding the decades-old case. Cold case prosecutions often present challenges that differ from those encountered in recent investigations. Witnesses may no longer be available because of death, illness, or the passage of time. Physical locations may have changed substantially. Documentary evidence must therefore assume increased importance, and investigators frequently rely upon preserved reports created by detectives who are no longer living or no longer employed by the investigating agency. The Walker case benefited from the extensive documentation prepared during the original investigation. Detectives in 1974 had carefully recorded witness interviews, evidence collection procedures, and crime scene observations. Those reports allowed modern investigators to reconstruct the original investigation with considerable accuracy despite the passage of decades. During pretrial proceedings, attorneys addressed various legal issues commonly associated with older criminal prosecutions. Courts examined the admissibility of forensic evidence, reviewed laboratory procedures, and considered whether investigative methods satisfied applicable legal standards. DNA evidence introduced in court generally requires expert testimony explaining how samples were collected, analyzed, and interpreted according to accepted scientific principles. Investigative genetic genealogy also attracted attention because it represented a relatively recent investigative technique. It is important to distinguish between the genealogy process and the evidence ultimately presented at trial. Genetic genealogy served as an investigative tool that directed detectives toward a potential suspect. The criminal case itself relied upon the direct forensic DNA comparison between McCurley's known DNA sample and the biological evidence recovered from the original investigation. This distinction reflects an important principle in criminal investigations. Investigative techniques used to identify suspects are not necessarily the same evidence presented to establish guilt. Once detectives identify a suspect through lawful investigative methods, they seek independently admissible evidence capable of satisfying judicial standards. Throughout 2020 and 2021, additional court proceedings continued while prosecutors and defense attorneys prepared their respective cases. Investigators remained available to explain both the original 1974 investigation and the modern forensic analyses performed decades later. Forensic scientists likewise prepared to describe laboratory procedures, DNA interpretation, and statistical conclusions supporting the identification. The case also highlighted broader developments occurring throughout American criminal justice. Numerous cold cases from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s were being reopened because advances in DNA technology permitted evidence collected decades earlier to be re-examined successfully. Investigators increasingly recognized that preserving biological evidence indefinitely could provide future opportunities, even when available forensic methods initially proved insufficient. The Walker investigation became an example frequently cited by law enforcement agencies discussing the importance of evidence preservation. Had biological material been discarded, improperly stored, or inadequately documented during the original investigation, later scientific advances might never have been able to identify the suspect. As court proceedings continued, media coverage frequently revisited the history of the investigation. Reports described how detectives had spent decades reviewing the file, preserving evidence, and waiting for technological developments capable of answering questions that traditional investigative methods had been unable to resolve. The story illustrated the patience often required in cold case investigations, where breakthroughs sometimes occur only after substantial advances in forensic science. For investigators who had inherited the case years after the original crime, the arrest represented the culmination of work spanning multiple generations of detectives, forensic scientists, evidence technicians, prosecutors, and laboratory personnel. No single investigator had solved the case independently. Instead, the eventual identification resulted from decades of cumulative effort combined with scientific innovation. Although the arrest was a significant milestone, the legal process remained ongoing. Under the American criminal justice system, criminal responsibility is determined through judicial proceedings rather than by investigative conclusions alone. Prosecutors therefore continued preparing the evidence for presentation in court while ensuring that all constitutional and procedural safeguards were observed. The Carla Walker investigation had progressed from an unsolved homicide with no identified suspect to a criminal prosecution supported by modern forensic evidence. Yet the final determination regarding criminal responsibility would depend upon the judicial process, where evidence collected in 1974 and analyzed using 21st century science would ultimately be evaluated under the rules governing criminal trials in Texas. After investigators developed a potential suspect through investigative genetic genealogy, the next stage of the investigation required a direct forensic comparison. Genetic genealogy had helped identify a person of interest, but it could not by itself establish that the individual's DNA matched biological evidence recovered during the original investigation. Investigators, therefore, sought a reference DNA sample that could be compared with the DNA profile previously developed from evidence preserved in the Carla Walker homicide investigation. According to publicly available court records, detectives conducted surveillance on Glenn Samuel McCurley and collected a discarded item believed to contain biological material. The collection of abandoned items for DNA analysis is a technique that has been used in criminal investigations when investigators are seeking a comparison sample subject to applicable laws and legal standards. The purpose of obtaining this reference sample was not to prove guilt on its own. Instead, it was intended to answer a specific forensic question: whether the DNA obtained from the item associated with McCurley matched the unknown DNA profile recovered from evidence collected during the 1974 investigation. Once the sample was collected, it was submitted to a forensic laboratory for analysis. Laboratory personnel followed established procedures for evidence handling, DNA extraction, profile development, and comparison. Documentation of the evidence transfer and testing process was maintained to preserve the chain of custody. Forensic analysts then compared the reference DNA profile with the profile developed from the preserved crime scene evidence. Unlike investigative genetic genealogy, which identifies possible relatives and investigative leads, this comparison involved direct DNA analysis between two samples. According to court records, the laboratory comparison indicated that the DNA profiles were consistent with originating from the same individual. Statistical analysis was used to evaluate the significance of the match and determine the likelihood that the same DNA profile would occur in an unrelated person. This forensic confirmation became a critical component of the investigation. It transformed McCurley from a person identified through genealogical research into a suspect connected by direct biological evidence to material collected during the original homicide investigation. The collection and analysis of the reference DNA sample demonstrated the relationship between modern forensic technology and traditional detective work. Genetic genealogy helped investigators locate a possible suspect, while direct DNA comparison provided the scientific evidence needed for the criminal case. The process also highlighted the importance of preserving evidence over long periods. The biological material collected in 1974 remained available for examination decades later, allowing investigators to apply technologies that did not exist when the crime was first investigated. The Carla Walker case became one example of how cold case investigations can progress through multiple stages: preservation of original evidence, advances in forensic science, investigative research, and final laboratory confirmation. Each stage contributed to the eventual legal resolution of a case that had remained unsolved for nearly half a century. Following the forensic comparison between the reference DNA sample associated with Glenn Samuel McCurley and the DNA profile developed from evidence preserved in the Carla Walker homicide investigation, investigators moved forward with the next stage of the case, presenting their findings for legal review. After examining the evidence gathered during the renewed investigation, authorities determined that there was sufficient basis to proceed with criminal charges. On February 21, SIL 2020, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested in connection with the 1974 murder of Carla Walker. The arrest marked a major development in an investigation that had remained unresolved for nearly 46 years. However, as with all criminal cases in the United States, an arrest represented an accusation rather than a determination of guilt. The case then moved into the judicial process, where prosecutors were required to present evidence meeting the legal standards established by the court system. The prosecution's case relied on several categories of evidence collected across different periods of the investigation. These included the original police records from 1974, witness statements, crime scene documentation, forensic laboratory results, and the modern DNA analysis that connected McCurley to biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. One important aspect of the case was the continuity between the original investigation and the modern forensic work. Detectives in 1974 had preserved evidence and maintained documentation that allowed later investigators and forensic scientists to examine the material using technologies unavailable at the time of collection. The legal proceedings also involved examination of the scientific methods used during the investigation. DNA evidence presented in court requires explanation from forensic experts, including how samples were collected, how profiles were developed, and how statistical calculations support the conclusions reached by laboratory analysts. The role of investigative genetic genealogy was also distinct from the role of forensic DNA comparison. Genetic genealogy helped investigators identify a possible suspect by examining biological relationships through genealogy databases and historical records. The direct comparison between McCurley's DNA sample and the crime scene DNA provided the forensic evidence used to establish the biological connection. During the legal process, both prosecutors and defense attorneys had the opportunity to examine the evidence, challenge interpretations, and address legal questions related to the investigation. This review process is a fundamental part of the criminal justice system, particularly in cases involving decades-old evidence and evolving forensic technologies. The case also attracted attention because it reflected a broader trend in law enforcement, the reopening of unsolved crimes through advances in DNA science. Investigations from earlier decades often contain preserved evidence that could not be fully analyzed at the time. Improvements in laboratory techniques allowed many agencies to revisit those cases with new capabilities. In 2021, McCurley pleaded guilty to the murder of Carla Walker. The plea brought the criminal proceedings to a conclusion without a jury trial. He was sentenced to life in prison. The resolution of the case demonstrated the importance of cooperation between multiple areas of investigation. The original detectives who documented the evidence in 1974, the evidence technicians who preserved it, forensic scientists who analyzed it decades later, genealogists who assisted with investigative leads, and prosecutors who presented the case all contributed to the final outcome. The case became an example of how long unsolved investigations can be revisited when old evidence is preserved and new scientific methods become available. It also reinforced a central principle of cold case work. The passage of time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of resolution when physical evidence remains available and investigative methods continue to evolve. The resolution of the Carla Walker homicide investigation highlighted a central principle in modern criminal investigations. Evidence collected decades earlier can remain valuable when it is properly preserved. The case demonstrated how advances in forensic science can transform evidence that was once considered limited into information capable of identifying an individual. When Carla Walker's murder was investigated in 1974, forensic technology was far different from what exists today. Investigators did not have access to DNA profiling, genetic genealogy, or computerized forensic databases. The tools available at the time focused primarily on traditional methods such as fingerprints, blood typing, fiber examination, and other forms of physical comparison. Although these methods provided investigators with important information, they often could not identify an unknown offender with the precision available through modern DNA testing. As a result, evidence collected during the original investigation remained preserved while the case remained unsolved. The importance of evidence storage became clear decades later. Biological material recovered during the original investigation was eventually examined using advanced forensic techniques. Scientists were able to extract and analyze DNA from preserved evidence, creating a profile that became central to the renewed investigation. The process required careful scientific procedures. Forensic laboratories must follow strict standards to prevent contamination and ensure that test results are accurate. Evidence handling records, storage documentation, and laboratory procedures all contribute to establishing reliability. One of the most significant developments in the investigation was the ability to analyze biological material that had been collected before DNA testing existed. Modern forensic laboratories can often recover genetic information from smaller or older samples than was possible in previous decades. This progress has changed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. Previously, an investigation might become inactive because available evidence could not identify a suspect. Today, preserved evidence may provide new opportunities when technology advances. The Carla Walker case also demonstrated that DNA evidence is most effective when combined with traditional investigative methods. A DNA profile alone does not explain how or why a person is connected to a crime. Investigators must interpret scientific results alongside historical records, witness accounts, timelines, and other evidence. In this investigation, multiple generations of law enforcement personnel contributed to the eventual resolution. Original investigators documented the crime scene and preserved evidence. Later detectives reviewed the case file and evaluated new forensic possibilities. Laboratory scientists applied modern testing methods. Investigators then used additional investigative techniques to identify and confirm a suspect. The case also reflected the growing importance of multidisciplinary cooperation in cold case investigations. Modern investigations often involve police detectives, forensic analysts, prosecutors, genealogists, and specialists from different fields working together. Evidence preservation has become a major focus for law enforcement agencies because many unsolved crimes remain unresolved, not because evidence was absent, but because the available technology was not advanced enough at the time. Maintaining evidence allows future investigators to apply scientific methods that may not yet exist. The investigation into Carla Walker's murder became part of a broader national discussion about the use of forensic technology in solving historical crimes. Numerous cold cases across the United States have been reconsidered through improved DNA testing and investigative techniques. However, forensic science must always be applied carefully. DNA results require proper interpretation, legal review, and supporting evidence. Scientific methods provide powerful information, but criminal cases still depend on careful investigation and judicial evaluation. The significance of the Walker investigation was therefore not only the identification of a suspect after decades, but also the demonstration of how investigative persistence and technological advancement can work together. The case began with traditional detective work in 1974 and concluded through a combination of historical evidence and modern forensic analysis. It illustrated how decisions made during the earliest stages of an investigation, especially the preservation of physical evidence, can influence the possibility of justice many years later. The resolution of the Carla Walker homicide investigation became part of a larger transformation occurring in criminal investigations across the United States. For decades, many unsolved cases remained inactive because investigators lacked the technology necessary to identify unknown offenders. The development of advanced DNA analysis and investigative genetic genealogy changed the way law enforcement agencies approach these long-standing investigations. Cold cases often present unique challenges. Witnesses may become unavailable. memories may fade, physical locations may change, and original investigators may retire. However, when evidence is carefully preserved, a case can remain open to future scientific developments. The Walker investigation demonstrated the importance of maintaining physical evidence even when no immediate solution appears possible. The biological evidence collected in 1974 remained stored for decades, allowing modern forensic scientists to examine it using methods unavailable at the time of the original investigation. This approach has influenced how police departments manage unsolved cases. Many agencies have established dedicated cold case units responsible for reviewing older investigations, identifying evidence suitable for modern testing, and determining whether advances in forensic science may provide new opportunities. One of the most significant developments in recent years has been the increased use of DNA technology. Traditional forensic methods often relied on comparisons involving fingerprints, physical descriptions, or eyewitness accounts. While these methods remain important, DNA analysis provides a different type of evidence by examining biological material at a genetic level. The Walker case also demonstrated the difference between investigative tools and courtroom evidence. Investigative genetic genealogy helped guide detectives toward a potential suspect by examining biological relationships and historical records. However, the criminal case required additional confirmation through direct DNA testing and other evidence. This distinction has become an important consideration in modern forensic investigations. Genetic genealogy can generate leads, but investigators must still conduct traditional police work to establish whether a person is connected to a specific crime. The use of genetic genealogy has also led to broader discussions regarding privacy, legal standards, and responsible investigative practices. Because genealogy databases may contain information about individuals who have not been involved in criminal activity, law enforcement agencies and policymakers have emphasized the importance of clear procedures and appropriate oversight. In addition to technological advances, the case highlighted the importance of collaboration. Solving a decades-old homicide often requires cooperation between multiple groups. Police investigators who understand the historical details of the case, forensic scientists who analyze biological evidence, genealogists who research complex family relationships, prosecutors who evaluate legal requirements, evidence specialists who maintain records and chain of custody. The Walker investigation involved this type of cooperation across generations. The detectives who first investigated the crime could not have predicted the scientific tools that would eventually become available. Their work created the foundation for future investigators to continue pursuing answers. The case also reinforced the value of persistence in criminal investigations. Many cold cases remain unresolved for years or decades, but investigators often continue reviewing evidence when new information becomes available. Across the United States, families of homicide victims have increasingly benefited from these developments. Advances in forensic science have allowed authorities to revisit cases that had previously reached investigative limits. Some have resulted in arrests, while others have provided answers about what happened even when prosecution was no longer possible. The Carla Walker case became an example frequently discussed in relation to these developments because of the length of time between the crime and its resolution. Nearly half a century passed between the original investigation and the identification of the person responsible. The case also illustrated the evolving nature of forensic science. Techniques considered impossible in 1974 became standard investigative tools decades later. The evidence itself did not change. The ability to interpret it changed. For law enforcement agencies, the lesson was clear. Preserving evidence is an investment in future possibilities. A case that cannot be solved today may become solvable tomorrow because science continues to advance. The investigation also demonstrated that technology alone does not solve crimes. DNA testing provided important information, but detectives still had to review records, evaluate leads, confirm identities, and build a legally sufficient case. Modern cold case investigations are therefore built on the combination of science and traditional investigative principles. Laboratory results must be supported by documentation, context, and careful analysis. The conclusion of the Carla Walker case represented more than the resolution of one homicide investigation. It reflected a broader change in criminal justice, the recognition that unanswered cases can continue to move forward when evidence is preserved and investigators remain committed to reviewing new possibilities. The case became a reminder that time does not always erase evidence. In some investigations, decades of unanswered questions can eventually be addressed through the combined efforts of dedicated investigators and advances in science. The conclusion of the Carla Walker homicide investigation represented the final stage of a process that had extended across nearly 5 decades. What began as an unsolved crime investigation in 1974 eventually became a modern example of how historical evidence, forensic technology, and continued investigative efforts can combine to resolve a cold case. After Glenn, Samuel McCurley was identified through investigative genetic genealogy and confirmed through direct DNA comparison, the case moved from the investigative phase into the criminal justice system. Prosecutors were tasked with reviewing the evidence and determining how the case would proceed. The evidence presented for consideration included material from both the original investigation and the later forensic examination. This included police reports created in 1974, witness accounts, crime scene documentation, laboratory findings, and the DNA comparison that linked McCurley to biological evidence preserved from the original investigation. A major factor in the case was the ability to connect modern scientific findings with historical investigative records. The original detectives had documented their work decades earlier, preserving information about the crime scene, interviews, and evidence collection. Those records allowed later investigators and prosecutors to reconstruct the investigation despite the passage of time. Cold case prosecutions often face challenges that do not exist in more recent cases. Memories can change over decades, witnesses may become unavailable, and physical locations may no longer appear as they did at the time of the crime. Because of these challenges, prosecutors typically rely heavily on preserved documentation and scientific evidence. The DNA evidence became a central component of the case. Modern forensic analysis allowed investigators to compare genetic material collected during the original investigation with a known reference sample associated with McCurley. According to court records, this comparison supported the conclusion that McCurley was the source of the DNA profile connected to the crime scene evidence. The case also demonstrated the importance of separating investigative discovery from courtroom proof. The genealogical research that helped identify McCurley was an investigative method used to generate a lead. The evidence used to establish the connection in court came from direct forensic testing and the broader body of investigative evidence. Following his arrest in 2020, McCurley faced prosecution for the murder of Carla Walker. The case attracted considerable public attention because of the length of time it had remained unresolved and because of the role of modern forensic science in identifying a suspect. In 2021, McCurley pleaded guilty to the murder of Carla Walker. The plea agreement brought the criminal proceedings to an end without a jury trial. He received a sentence of life imprisonment. The conclusion of the case provided a legal resolution after decades of uncertainty. For law enforcement, it represented the culmination of work conducted by multiple generations of investigators. The detectives who first responded to the crime scene in 1974, the evidence technicians who preserved the material collected at that time, the forensic scientists who later analyzed the DNA, and the investigators who pursued modern leads all contributed to the outcome. Beyond the individual case, the investigation became part of a larger conversation about the future of cold case work. Law enforcement agencies increasingly recognize that unsolved cases should not necessarily be considered permanently unsolvable. Scientific advances can create new opportunities even after many years have passed. The case highlighted several important lessons for modern investigations. First, evidence preservation is essential. The ability to examine biological evidence decades later depended on decisions made during the original investigation. Second, forensic science continues to evolve. Techniques unavailable in the 1970s became critical tools in the 21st century. Third, successful investigations require cooperation between different disciplines. No single method solved the case. Instead, investigators combined historical records, DNA analysis, genealogy research, and traditional detective work. The case also influenced public understanding of forensic genealogy. Many people became more familiar with the idea that genetic information could be used not only for family history research, but also as an investigative resource in criminal cases. At the same time, the growing use of genetic genealogy has encouraged discussions about privacy, consent, and appropriate legal safeguards. As the technology continues to develop, law enforcement agencies and policymakers continue examining how it should be applied responsibly. For families affected by unsolved crimes, cases like Carla Walker's demonstrate the possibility that answers may still emerge many years later. While no investigation can erase the loss caused by a violent crime, identifying the person responsible can provide an important sense of accountability through the justice system. The Carla Walker case also serves as a historical example of how criminal investigations evolve over time. The investigators who worked in 1974 operated with the tools available to them. Later investigators inherited the same evidence, but possessed entirely different scientific capabilities. The physical evidence remained unchanged. What changed was humanity's ability to understand it. Nearly 46 years after Carla Walker's death, the investigation reached its conclusion through a combination of persistence, preservation, and scientific advancement. The case became a reminder that unresolved investigations may continue to hold answers, even when those answers remain hidden for decades. The legacy of the investigation extends beyond the courtroom. It represents the continuing effort of law enforcement and forensic science to revisit unanswered questions, apply new knowledge, and pursue justice through careful and evidence-based investigation. The resolution of the Carla Walker homicide investigation became an important example of how cold case investigations have changed in the modern era. The case demonstrated that the passage of time does not necessarily eliminate the possibility of identifying a suspect, particularly when physical evidence has been carefully preserved and new scientific methods become available. For many decades, investigators working on older homicide cases faced a fundamental limitation. The evidence collected during an investigation was often stronger than the technology available to analyze it. In 1974, detectives investigating Carla Walker's murder gathered physical evidence and documented the crime scene, but forensic science had not yet developed the ability to extract individual identification from biological material. The emergence of DNA profiling changed that process. Modern DNA analysis allowed investigators to examine biological evidence at a level of detail that was impossible during the original investigation. Instead of relying only on traditional methods such as witness descriptions or physical comparisons, detectives could use genetic information to establish connections between evidence and individuals. The Walker case illustrated the importance of preserving evidence beyond the immediate needs of an investigation. When evidence is properly collected, documented, and stored, it can remain valuable for future generations of investigators. Scientific methods that do not exist today may become available decades later. This principle has influenced law enforcement policies across the United States. Many agencies have developed procedures for maintaining biological evidence from unsolved cases because investigators understand that future technology may provide answers that current methods cannot. Another significant aspect of the case was the combination of investigative techniques. The eventual resolution did not come from one single discovery. Instead, investigators used a sequence of methods. Review of historical police records. Examination of preserved physical evidence. Modern DNA testing. Investigative genetic genealogy. Traditional detective work. Legal review of evidence. Each step contributed information that helped move the investigation forward. The case also demonstrated the difference between identifying a suspect and proving a criminal case. Investigators may develop a person of interest through various methods. But prosecutors must establish a case using evidence that meets legal standards. In the Walker investigation, genealogical research helped direct investigators toward a potential suspect, while direct DNA comparison provided forensic confirmation. The use of investigative genetic genealogy in cases like this has also influenced discussions about the future of criminal investigations. The technique has helped law enforcement agencies revisit crimes that had remained unresolved for decades, but it has also raised questions about privacy, database policies, and the appropriate limits of genetic investigations. As a result, agencies using this method have increasingly emphasized transparency, legal oversight, and careful procedures. The goal is to balance the potential of new technology with respect for individual privacy and established legal protections. The Carla Walker investigation also highlighted the human element of cold cases. Behind every investigation file are families who have waited years or decades for answers. While forensic technology can provide identification and evidence, the process of resolving a case also involves acknowledging the impact that unresolved crimes have on relatives and communities. For investigators, cold cases require patience and persistence. Detectives assigned to older cases often inherit files created by previous generations of law enforcement officers. They must study historical documents, understand earlier investigative decisions, and determine whether modern tools can provide new opportunities. The Walker investigation reflected this continuity between past and present. The work of the original investigators remained relevant because the evidence they collected and the records they created allowed future investigators to continue the search for answers. The case also became part of a wider trend in American criminal justice. Across the country, advances in forensic science have contributed to the reopening and resolution of numerous older investigations. Crimes that once appeared impossible to solve have been reconsidered because technology has expanded what investigators can discover. However, forensic science remains only one component of criminal investigation. DNA results must be interpreted carefully and placed within the broader context of evidence. Successful cases require cooperation between scientists, detectives, prosecutors, and courts. The conclusion of the Carla Walker investigation demonstrated the importance of combining scientific innovation with traditional investigative principles. Technology provided new opportunities, but those opportunities became meaningful because investigators had preserved evidence, maintained records, and continued reviewing the case. The case stands as an example of how criminal investigations can evolve over time. Evidence collected in one era may be interpreted differently in another. Questions that remain unanswered for decades may eventually receive attention through advances in science and renewed investigative efforts. The broader lesson from the investigation is that cold cases are not simply stories from the past. They remain active records of unanswered questions, preserved evidence, and ongoing efforts to understand what happened. The resolution of the Walker case showed that time can delay justice, but it does not always prevent it. The Carla Walker homicide investigation became part of a larger transformation in how law enforcement agencies approach unsolved crimes. The case demonstrated that cold case investigations are not static files that simply disappear with time. Instead, they can evolve as technology, investigative methods, and scientific understanding improve. For decades, many homicide investigations reached a point where available evidence could not provide a clear identification. Detectives could collect information, interview witnesses, and examine physical evidence, but the tools necessary to connect evidence to a specific individual often did not exist. The development of forensic DNA analysis changed this reality. DNA technology introduced a new level of precision into criminal investigations. Biological evidence that once provided only limited information could now produce genetic profiles capable of identifying individuals. This development led many law enforcement agencies to review older cases and determine whether preserved evidence could be re-examined. The Walker investigation reflected this broader shift. Evidence collected during the original investigation remained available for decades, allowing scientists to apply modern techniques that were unimaginable when the case began. The case also demonstrated that solving a cold case requires more than scientific advancement. Technology creates opportunities, but investigators must still carefully analyze information, verify leads, and build a complete understanding of the circumstances surrounding a crime. Modern cold case investigations often begin with a comprehensive review of original materials. Detectives examine original police reports, evidence inventories, laboratory notes, witness statements, photographs, investigative timelines, previous suspect information. This process allows investigators to identify evidence that may have new value because of advances in forensic science. In the Carla Walker investigation, historical records played an important role because they provided the foundation for understanding the original events. The documentation created in 1974 allowed later investigators to revisit the case with a clearer picture of the evidence and investigative history. The increased use of investigative genetic genealogy has become another major development in cold case work. This method has assisted investigators in cases where traditional DNA database searches produce no match. However, the process requires careful interpretation. Genetic genealogy does not identify a criminal by itself. Instead, it identifies biological relationships that investigators must analyze through traditional genealogy and police work. Professional genealogists may spend extensive time constructing family trees and reviewing historical records. Their work requires attention to detail because distant family relationships can involve hundreds or thousands of potential individuals. Once investigators identify a possible suspect, they must independently verify the connection through additional evidence. This may include forensic testing, witness information, historical records, and other investigative findings. The Walker case illustrated this layered approach. Genetic genealogy helped generate an investigative direction, while direct DNA comparison and other evidence were necessary to establish the legal case. Another important lesson from modern cold cases is the importance of collaboration. Investigations involving advanced forensic methods often require specialists from different fields working together. A single case may involve police detectives, crime laboratory analysts, DNA specialists, genealogists, prosecutors, and evidence technicians, legal experts. Each professional contributes a different area of knowledge, and the final outcome depends on combining these perspectives. The case also highlighted how the role of technology continues to expand. Artificial intelligence, improved laboratory techniques, advanced databases, and more sensitive DNA testing methods continue to influence the future of criminal investigations. At the same time, these technologies require responsible use. Investigators must balance the potential benefits of new methods with legal requirements and ethical considerations. Privacy, consent, and proper oversight remain important issues as forensic tools continue to develop. For families of victims, advances in forensic science have created new possibilities for answers. Many relatives of victims in unsolved cases have spent years or decades without knowing who was responsible or what happened. When a case is resolved, the legal outcome cannot undo the past, but it can provide accountability and a documented conclusion. The Walker investigation also emphasized the importance of persistence among investigators. Cold cases often require patience because breakthroughs may depend on future discoveries rather than immediate results. Detectives working on older cases frequently inherit investigations started by people who are no longer involved. Their responsibility is to preserve the original work, evaluate it objectively, and determine whether new information can change the investigation. The resolution of the Carla Walker case represented this continuity. The evidence collected during the original investigation, the records maintained over decades, and the modern forensic analysis all became parts of a single investigative process. The broader significance of the case lies not only in the final identification of a suspect, but also in what it revealed about the changing nature of criminal investigations. A crime investigated in the 1970s was eventually resolved using technology developed decades later, the evidence did not become more meaningful because it changed. It became more meaningful because science developed new ways to interpret it. The case became a reminder that unresolved investigations may continue to hold answers. Advances in forensic science have changed the relationship between time and evidence, creating opportunities for investigators to revisit questions that once seemed impossible to answer. The continuing evolution of cold case investigations shows that justice can depend on both the work of the past and the discoveries of the future. Evidence preservation, scientific progress, and investigative dedication together form the foundation for solving crimes that have remained unanswered for generations. The resolution of the Carla Walker homicide investigation represented more than the conclusion of a criminal case. It also marked the end of decades of uncertainty surrounding a crime that had affected a family, investigators, and a community for generations. When Carla Walker was killed in 1974, the investigation began during an era when forensic technology was limited compared with modern standards. Detectives relied primarily on interviews, physical evidence examination, and investigative experience. Although investigators worked extensively to identify the person responsible, the available tools did not provide the answers needed at that time. The passing of decades created a unique challenge. Many cold cases become increasingly difficult as time goes on because witnesses may become unavailable, memories may change, and physical circumstances may no longer remain the same. However, the continued preservation of evidence allowed the investigation to remain open to future developments. The eventual resolution demonstrated the importance of maintaining investigative records and physical evidence over long periods. Without those materials, modern forensic methods would not have been able to contribute to the case. For the Walker family, the investigation represented a long search for accountability. Families affected by unresolved violent crimes often experience years of unanswered questions. The absence of an identified offender can leave relatives without a clear understanding of what happened and without a formal conclusion through the justice system. The identification and prosecution of a suspect provided a legal resolution after many years of uncertainty. While the outcome could not change the events of 1974, the criminal justice process established responsibility through the courts. The case also had an impact on the wider community. Long unsolved crimes often remain part of local history, especially when the victim was a young person whose disappearance and death affected friends, neighbors, and residents of the surrounding area. The investigation remained significant because it demonstrated that cold cases can continue to receive attention even after many years. The work performed by investigators decades later depended heavily on the efforts of those who handled the original case. This continuity between generations of investigators is a defining characteristic of cold case work. A detective reviewing a decades-old file must rely on information collected by people who may no longer be available to explain their decisions. Detailed documentation becomes essential because it allows future investigators to understand what was known, what was tested, and what questions remained unanswered. The Walker investigation also contributed to public awareness of forensic genealogy. Before recent years, many people were unfamiliar with the idea that DNA information could be used to identify unknown individuals through family relationships. As several high-profile cases received national attention, investigative genetic genealogy became one of the most discussed developments in modern criminal investigation. The technique has changed how some law enforcement agencies approach unsolved cases. Investigators can now consider possibilities that did not exist decades earlier. A person who never appeared in a traditional criminal DNA database may still potentially be identified through biological relatives and genealogical research. However, the case also reflected the importance of careful application of forensic technology. Scientific tools must be combined with proper procedures, legal standards, and independent verification. The Walker investigation showed that technology alone does not solve crimes. DNA analysis provided important information, but investigators still needed to review historical evidence, verify leads, and establish a legally valid case. This combination of old and new methods represents the modern approach to many cold cases. investigators use advanced science while relying on traditional principles of evidence collection, documentation, and analysis. The case also highlighted the continuing importance of victim-centered investigations. Modern cold case units often emphasize that every unsolved homicide represents a person, a family, and a community waiting for answers. Behind every forensic report and investigative file is the story of someone whose life was affected by the crime. The purpose of solving cold cases is not only identifying offenders, but also recognizing the victims and restoring a measure of justice. The Carla Walker investigation became an example of how persistence can extend across generations. The detectives who began the investigation in 1974 could not have used DNA technology or genetic genealogy. The investigators who eventually resolved the case relied on their work and the evidence they preserved. The case therefore represents a connection between different eras of criminal investigation. The past provided the evidence. The present provided the technology. Together, they created the possibility of resolution. Beyond this individual investigation, the case became part of a larger movement toward using science to revisit unresolved crimes. Police departments, forensic laboratories, and prosecutors across the country have increasingly invested in reviewing older cases because new methods may provide answers that were previously impossible. The continuing advancement of forensic science means that other cold cases may also benefit from evidence preserved decades earlier. Each investigation provides lessons about evidence management, investigative cooperation, and the responsible use of technology. The historical importance of the Carla Walker case lies in this broader message. Time does not always prevent justice. Investigations may remain unresolved for years, but preserved evidence and advancing science can create new opportunities. The conclusion of the case marked the end of one chapter in a decades-long investigation. It also demonstrated the continuing evolution of criminal justice, where evidence collected in one generation can become the key to solving a case in another. The conclusion of the Carla Walker homicide investigation marked the end of one of Fort Worth's longest-running unresolved criminal cases. Nearly 5 decades separated the original investigation in 1974 from the legal resolution in the 21st century. The case became an example of how advances in forensic science, combined with persistent investigative work, can change the outcome of investigations that once appeared impossible to solve. When investigators first responded to Carla Walker's disappearance and death in February 1974, they operated with the forensic resources available at the time. Detectives collected evidence, documented the crime scene, interviewed witnesses, and followed investigative leads. However, the scientific tools necessary to identify an unknown offender through biological evidence had not yet been developed. The evidence collected during that original investigation remained an important part of the case's future. Because it was preserved and documented, later investigators were able to revisit it when forensic technology advanced. The development of DNA profiling transformed criminal investigations worldwide. Biological evidence that once provided limited information could now produce genetic profiles capable of establishing connections between individuals and crime scenes. In the Walker investigation, modern DNA analysis created an opportunity that did not exist in 1974. Investigators were able to develop a DNA profile from preserved evidence and use that information as part of a renewed effort to identify the person responsible. When traditional law enforcement DNA databases did not provide a direct match, investigators used investigative genetic genealogy to generate additional leads. This approach combined genetic information with traditional genealogical research to identify possible biological relationships and narrow the field of potential individuals. The process required extensive analysis of historical records and careful investigative review. Genealogy alone could not prove involvement in a crime. Instead, it provided investigators with a direction for further examination. After investigators focused on Glenn Samuel McCurley, they obtained a reference DNA sample and conducted a direct forensic comparison. According to court records, the comparison supported the conclusion that McCurley's DNA matched biological evidence connected to the original investigation. This distinction was important. The genealogical process helped identify a suspect, but the forensic DNA comparison provided the direct biological evidence used in the criminal case. The legal process that followed reflected the standards of the criminal justice system. Evidence had to be reviewed, tested, and presented according to established procedures. The prosecution relied on multiple forms of evidence rather than a single investigative method. In 2021, McCurley pleaded guilty to Carla Walker's murder and received a sentence of life imprisonment. The plea brought the criminal proceedings to a conclusion. The case became significant not only because of its outcome, but also because of what it represented for future investigations. It demonstrated that cold cases can remain active possibilities when evidence is preserved and investigators continue to examine new methods. Several important lessons emerged from the investigation. The first was the importance of evidence preservation. The ability to analyze decades-old biological material depended on decisions made during the original investigation. Without proper collection and storage, modern technology would not have been able to contribute. The second lesson was the value of combining different investigative approaches. The case was not solved by DNA alone, nor by genealogy alone. It required cooperation between detectives, forensic scientists, genealogists, prosecutors, and evidence specialists. The third lesson involved the continuing evolution of forensic science. Techniques that were unavailable in 1974 became central decades later. This demonstrates how scientific progress can change the possibilities within criminal investigations. The case also contributed to broader discussions about investigative genetic genealogy. As this method has become more common, law enforcement agencies have continued developing policies regarding privacy, transparency, and responsible use. The Walker investigation serves as an example of both the power and the limitations of forensic technology. Scientific tools can provide critical information, but they must be applied carefully and supported by traditional investigative practices. The case also reinforced the importance of viewing cold cases as ongoing investigations rather than permanently closed chapters. Many unsolved crimes contain evidence that may become meaningful only when new technology or new investigative methods become available. For investigators, the resolution represented the result of work carried out across multiple generations. The original detectives created the foundation. Later investigators recognized new possibilities. Scientists applied modern methods. Prosecutors guided the case through the legal system. The investigation, therefore, represents a connection between past and present. The evidence collected nearly half a century earlier remained relevant because it was preserved, documented, and eventually examined using new scientific capabilities. The broader legacy of the Carla Walker case is found in this relationship between time and evidence. The passing of years does not always eliminate the possibility of answers. In some cases, time allows science to develop the tools necessary to uncover information that was previously beyond reach. The case also serves as a reminder that behind every cold case investigation is a victim whose life was lost and a family seeking answers. While legal proceedings cannot undo the harm caused by a violent crime, identifying the person responsible provides accountability through the justice system. The resolution of the Carla Walker homicide investigation demonstrated how persistence, careful evidence management, and scientific advancement can work together. A case that remained unsolved for decades was eventually resolved because investigators continued to preserve, examine, and pursue the available evidence. The final chapter of the investigation was not written by one discovery alone. It was created through decades of combined effort, from the first responders and detectives in 1974 to the forensic specialists and investigators who applied modern methods many years later. The case remains an example of how criminal investigations continue to evolve. Evidence collected in one era can become the foundation for justice in another, proving that even after decades have passed, unanswered questions may still have answers waiting to be discovered.